Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so glad to see you all joining us this morning for this very special lecture with the Professor Martin Feldstein. I'm sure you all know Professor Feldstein. Actually, he has been with us a number of times before. I don't think he needs a long introduction. Only thing I can say is that he is the most respected economist in the United States today. So for that matter, in the world. You know, in recent months, the IMF has been releasing its World Economic Outlook, which has been continuously downwardly adjusted. In fact, last April, IMF released the most recent World Economic Outlook, which was again a bit downwardly adjusted from the last one it released, with only a few exceptions, and the U.S. economy is the exception. In fact, the U.S. economy was a little bit adjusted upward rather than downward, which is a good news to the rest of the world. So I'm sure you are so keenly interested in what's happening in the global economic scene, and particularly in the U.S., which is the most important economy in the world. Although, you know, on the purchasing power parity basis, the Chinese economy surpassed the U.S. economy last year. But in real world, based on the nominal exchange rate, the U.S. economy still is the most dominant and one-fourth of global economy. And so U.S. economy is important in that regard as well. Well, I'm sure the Professor Feldstein will share his insights and enlightening views on the U.S. economy and the rest of the world economies, and a bit about U.S. politics as well. I'm sure you hear a lot about candidate Trump and Hillary Clinton, and I'm sure you're all very much interested in what's happening there, U.S. politics, what are the prospects, and what impact it will have U.S. economic policy. But I think Professor will share his insights on this issue as well. I just want to say a few things about the Professor Feldstein, although you know him very well, but he still currently holds the chaired professorship at the Harvard University. He is George F. Baker Professor of Economics at Harvard, and also he is President Emeritus of National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute. It's the most prestigious economic research institute in the United States, which has been conducting nonpartisan economic research more than 100 years in the United States. He held the CEO and president's position nearly 30 years, and he still is associated with this NBER. And also, actually, he served President Reagan's government as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and President Reagan's chief economic advisor. I'm sure taking leave of absence from the Harvard University. He was also called in by the President Bush to serve as the member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Also, the President Obama appointed him to be a member of the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board. And as an academic economist, more importantly, he served as president of American Economic Association, which is, again, shows his peer group's respect for him. You know, he was, in 1977, when he was a young man, he's still a young man, but he was a little bit younger man, he was awarded with most prestigious, the John Bates Clark Medal of American Economic Association. This prize was awarded, has been awarded every 2 years. Now I understand it every year now, but every 2 years to the economist under the age of 40, who is judged to have made the greatest contribution to economic science, economic thought, and knowledge. So he was awarded with John Bates Clark Medal. And you know who others who got this award? You named the greatest economists. You know, starting from Paul Samuelson, Milton Friedman, to Paul Krugman and Larry Summers, you name it, all the greatest economists. So Martin Feldstein was one of the awardees in 1977. Since then, as I said, his association with NBER, he keep writing as the most insightful academic journal articles, and he contribute his newspaper columns and give lectures and advise government. And in addition, he also serves in various private corporations and business firms. In fact, on this trip, he is with Citadel, which is a global financial institution. In fact, he was here with Citadel as well. And Citadel is a global financial institution. I understand the firm manages assets for the many world's largest institutional investors, including sovereign wealth funds, pensions, and university endowments. And the Citadel is headquartered in Chicago, has offices in Asia and Europe and else. And this time he just stopped over in Seoul just one day, a meeting with the private groups with the Citadel. So I asked him to share his time. So he just arrived last night, and he started with this today with this lecture, and then he will have a busy all day today, and then he will go to Japan. In any case, I'm so glad to have Professor Feldstein this morning again, and he will enlighten us on the global economy and the U.S. economy. Now, with this, please join me in welcoming Professor Feldstein.
Thank you very much for that very, very generous and long introduction. Thank you for leaving me a little bit of time for my prepared remarks. But it's always nice to hear my life story spelled out in detail by an old friend whom I've known for, gosh, decades now. So I am going to talk about the U.S. economy, and then I'll talk about some of the other major industrial economies. But I'd be very happy during the question time to try to answer questions more generally. As Il Kang said, the U.S. economy is in good shape. Despite a slow start this year, I think we will see the economy growing at 2.5% during the coming months. And that's about what you would expect for an economy that is already at full employment, especially given some of the problems of measuring what is actually happening in the economy. The picture of the U.S. economy is distorted by the fact that energy prices have come down so dramatically in the past year, from over $100 a barrel to less than $50 now. And that has distorted the picture of inflation. If you look at the headline inflation, the headline consumer price index for the United States, it's increasing at about a little less than 1%. And if you take out the impact of energy, the increase in inflation is now over 2%, 2.2%. And a year ago, that same increase was 1.8%. So not only is inflation at a solid level, but it's also increasing as you would expect in an economy that is at full employment. The decline in energy prices also affects the picture that we all have of the real economy in the United States. Not only does it dramatically depress activity in the energy sector, but it has depressed manufacturing activity, industrial activity in the various industries that support what goes on in the energy sector. So we get a somewhat distorted picture of what's happening. But despite that, as I said, the U.S. economy is clearly in good shape. And the driver of the U.S. economy is, as always, the household sector, which represents about 70% of spending in GDP. So look at the household sector. We have full employment, an unemployment rate of 5%. For college graduates, the unemployment rate is less than half that, 2.4%. And these low unemployment rates are drawing more people into the labor force, so the labor force participation rate is higher now than it was a year ago. And it's also having the effect of pushing up real incomes. So real disposable personal incomes in the U.S. rose at 2.9% from the final quarter of last year to the first quarter of this year. Household wealth is also up, with home prices rising at about 5.5%. So all of that, the tight labor markets, rising income, rising home prices, all of that, according to the surveys, has contributed to a much stronger consumer confidence and better expectations about the future. And given that they have the money and that they're feeling more confident, consumers are spending more. We saw the most recent retail sales figures were up dramatically. The number for April represented a retail sales increase relative to just 1 month before of an increase of more than 1%. And that's up from a growth rate in the first quarter of more than 5%. So again, I would stress that the economy is in good shape. All the talk about secular stagnation and declining demand just doesn't fit with the numbers. But there are risks, and I want to talk about two kinds of risks. There are short-term risks, and I think they are getting more serious. Those are the risks that have been created by the monetary policy. We have had the so-called unconventional monetary policy now for nearly a decade. That meant exceptionally low, essentially zero short-term interest rates, and it meant the central bank buying large quantities of bonds to drive down long-term rates, so that the 10-year Treasury rate now is at only 1.8%, about half of what you would expect in an economy with the current inflation. So the result of this unconventional monetary policy, the result of these extremely low interest rates, has been to drive investors and lenders to take risks in order to reach for yield, in order to earn more on their assets. So we're seeing investors pushing up the prices of a wide range of assets. Look at the price-earnings ratio for the broad Standard & Poor's index of 500 securities. The price-earnings ratio for the S&P 500 is now more than 50%, 50%, higher than it's been in its historic average. Look at commercial real estate. The cap rates, the return on commercial real estate is extremely low. It's at levels that would make sense if current bond interest rates were going to stay this low forever, but at levels that don't make sense given that interest rates will eventually be rising. And of course, those long-term bond yields are again remarkably low, kept low by investors reaching for yield rather than trying to diversify away from that. So I think these are the risks that we face going forward, and when interest rates normalize, as eventually they will, when interest rates normalize, there are going to be losses. Losses to these investors in overpriced assets, losses to lenders who have been lending to lower quality borrowers, lending to borrowers with fewer conditions. And when those losses happen, they will undoubtedly have adverse effects on the economy. I'm not smart enough to know how bad those effects will be, but I must say I do worry about that. So that's the short-term risk, and the longer we see these very low interest rates continue, the greater those risks become. Looking at the longer-term risks, there I think the principal risk in the U.S. economy, as in other industrial economies, is the rising level of fiscal deficits and of the ratio of the national debt, the government debt, to GDP. If you go back a decade ago, our deficit was 1.7% of GDP. It's okay. It's not as good as it could be, but 1.7%. And the debt to GDP ratio was 36%. Now, that debt to GDP ratio is twice as high, 74%, and the deficit is 2.5%. And the Congressional Budget Office forecasts that a decade from now, the deficit, the annual deficit, will have doubled. We'll go from today's 2.5% to 4.9%. The debt to GDP ratio will be 84%, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and on a path that would take it to more than 100%. To me, that's a frightening prospect. If the world comes to believe that we're not going to fix those problems, that we're going to allow that to happen, then I think that investors around the world, and foreign investors now hold more than half of U.S. Treasury securities, foreign investors will insist on a higher interest rate. That higher interest rate will increase the cost of dealing with the debt, and that will cause our deficit to rise even faster. Now, fortunately, it doesn't take a lot to fix that problem. If the deficit, the annual deficit, instead of moving from today's 2.5% moving up, it just stayed where it is today, that would cause the debt to GDP ratio to be on a path coming down from today's 74% down to about 50%. So I think that's the challenge that the next government will face, to find ways of reducing the deficit and therefore slowing the growth of the debt. Let me turn to the monetary policy and what the Federal Reserve is up to. That's a really puzzling subject. The Fed lowered interest rates when the crisis hit and didn't do anything to raise interest rates until last December, when the Fed agreed to increase interest rates by 1/4%, so that the federal funds interest rate today is still a little less than 0.5% at a time when core inflation is about 2%. So we're looking at a very negative real interest rate. So far this year, even though the Fed in December said they would move up 4 times this year, so far this year, nothing has happened. The next meeting in June, it's not at all clear that they will do anything then. What is clear is that Janet Yellen and the majority in the chair of the FOM, of the Federal Reserve, and the members of the FOMC, the majority of those members, want to see short-term interest rates increase only very, very slowly. So their forecast is that by the end of next year, by the end of 2017, we'll still be looking at a federal funds interest rate which is negative in real terms. Based on their forecasts of inflation and their forecasts of the interest rate, they're saying that where they would like to see that rate move, will still leave it negative 18 months from now. I think that is wrong. I think that is bad policy. For an economy that is at full employment, that has a positive and rising rate of inflation, I think it's wrong to be keeping real interest rates negative. So why is the Fed doing that? I think it's important to distinguish between the excuses that the Fed gives in the statements that they release after their periodic meetings. It's important to distinguish those excuses from what I would say are the real reasons. So we've seen a series of excuses changing from time to time. In the beginning it was, well, the Chinese economy is slowing down, so we have to not raise interest rates. Not clear why that follows at all for the U.S. And then it was, well, the dollar is now rising, and that might hurt our exports, so we can't raise interest rates. Or the stock market is falling. Well, that has since turned around, so they take that excuse off the table. Or inflation is up, but maybe it won't stay up. Well, it's very hard. If those are the kind of excuses you use, it's very hard to ever decide to raise rates. So what are their real reasons? I think there are 2 real reasons why the Fed is not raising rates. The first, the obvious one, is they want to have a lower rate of unemployment. The Fed's own forecast is that the unemployment rate will come down from 5% now to 4.5% in 2018. 4.5% would be lower than the unemployment rate that the Fed itself says is the lowest sustainable rate of unemployment. Their own estimate of the long-term level for the unemployment rate is 4.8%. So they want to push that unemployment rate down beyond that in order to scoop up some more employment, in order to draw some more people into the labor force. But there's a second reason that they don't talk about, and that's this. The Fed is worried about what will happen if the economy turns down again. Remember, the last downturn happened back in 2008, so maybe it's going to happen again. And if it happens, the world will turn and at least the American public will turn to the Fed and say, well, what are you going to do about it? Historically, what the Fed has done when the economy turns down, what the Fed has done is to reduce interest rates sharply by, say, 300 basis points. Well, the Fed can't reduce interest rates now by 300 basis points because the rate today is less than 0.5%. So if they're going to reduce rates substantially in the future, they're going to have to get those rates up. So how are they going to get the rates from where they are today to 300 or 350 basis points without pushing the economy into a recession by doing so? Well, I think the answer is that their strategy, their plan, is to keep interest rates low for the next year or so to drive up the inflation rate, so that the inflation rate will go from today's roughly 2% to 3.5%. You might say, well, isn't that above their goal of 2% inflation? And the answer is, well, the goal was to have an average, they would say, of 2%. And since it's been below 2% for quite a while, it's not so bad if it stays above 2%. But if it gets up to 3.5%, then, of course, the Fed will want to stop the inflation from rising. It will be able to push up nominal interest rates, the Fed funds rate, be able to push up the Fed funds rate to 300 plus basis points, and that will give them the capacity to drive down interest rates if the economy weakens. So they're not saying that, and maybe they're not even thinking that, but I think that's what they're thinking. I think that's their goal, and it would be a very tough goal to pull off, but if I'm right, it means we're heading for higher inflation and higher interest rates in the U.S. So before I leave the U.S. and talk about other parts of the world, I want to say something about the problem of measuring real GDP in the United States. It's a subject I've been thinking about a lot. Ilse Kang and I talked about it at dinner last night. I'm writing about it. I think the government statisticians in the U.S. and indeed in every industrial country are given an impossibly difficult task of going from nominal GDP at market prices, to real GDP, taking into account the improvements in the quality of goods and services, taking into account the value to consumers of the introduction of new goods and services. That's a very tough thing to do, and I've been studying what, in fact, the U.S. authorities do. We all know that it's tough. We all know it's not done well, but until I dug in there and studied it in detail, I hadn't realized how bad the actual process is. So I would say that the official attempts just don't do it, that the official numbers do not deal adequately, they hardly deal at all with improvements in the quality of goods and services, and they don't even try to deal with the value created by the introduction of new goods and services. So what's the implication of that? It is that the real growth rates that we spend so much time focusing on are greatly underestimated, that the true growth of real incomes in the U.S., and I suspect in other countries as well, is substantially higher than the official numbers imply. In the U.S., over the last 30 years, real growth is estimated officially to have been 1.7%, real per capita GDP. The reality could be 2-3 percentage points higher than that. There's no way to know. But I think the key thing is for policymakers and for those of us who talk to the public is to make it clear that the official numbers greatly underestimate what has been happening to the increasing output of our economy. Well, let me turn from the U.S. to Europe. And of course, it's very hard to talk about Europe. There's so much diversity among the individual European countries. You have Germany with an unemployment rate of 6% and Spain with an unemployment rate of more than 20%. But I think if you look at the Eurozone as a whole, what we see is a region with very weak economic activity and poor prospects for the future. The unemployment rate is stuck at more than 10%. The inflation rate is about 0. The debt to GDP ratios are about 100% in major countries, not in Germany, but in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, and elsewhere. And the economic problems are compounded by two political developments. The first is the refugee crisis. 1 million refugees coming to Germany last year, more coming now, and a conflict within the Eurozone about, and within the EU more generally, about who will take those incoming refugees and what will be done about border permissions to cross borders, the Schengen arrangements. The other political risk that we see in Europe is the risk of a breakup of the European Union. I've been following what's been happening ever since the creation of the European Union, and I've not seen as much nervousness in Europe as there is today about the possibility that it might just fall apart. There's the British vote coming next month about whether Britain will formally leave the European Union. They're not part of the common currency, they're not part of the Eurozone, but they might pull out completely. But we also see polls in other countries, in Italy and France and elsewhere, indicating that the public doesn't feel that they're benefiting from their membership in the European Union. So there is a serious risk. But back to the economics, I think the problem of increasing real growth and reducing the unemployment rate is a problem for which the Europeans do not have a viable policy. When Mario Draghi came to the Federal Reserve Conference in Jackson Hole in August of 2014, he said there are 3 things that could stimulate growth in Europe. One would be structural reforms to labor and product markets, and he said, but it's not happening and it doesn't look like it is going to happen. And unfortunately, that's still true. Another thing would be a fiscal stimulus from those countries that have the room to do it. That's a euphemism for Germany, because the others already have such high levels of debt that they can't do it. Germany likes to have a budget surplus, and they're not going to do it. So it comes down to the third thing, and that is what he said the ECB will do, which is to lower interest rates. And they have certainly done that with a vengeance. So we have short-term rates which are negative. We have 10-year rates which are negative in a number of countries in Europe. Well, what's that accomplished? The hope might have been that it would accomplish what it did in the United States, in which lower interest rates across the spectrum of yields, lower interest rates led to an increase in equity prices. Households got richer. They went out and spent more. And that's what brought back the U.S. recovery in 2009 and 2010 and beyond. But that is not happening in Europe, because Europe doesn't have the kind of widespread share ownership that the United States does. So that route for going from easier money to higher equity prices to more consumer spending doesn't work in Europe. So the alternative was a decline in the value of the euro, making it more competitive. And that certainly happened. The euro came down from 140 when Mario Draghi was speaking in Jackson Hole in the summer of 2014. It came down from 140 to 106 before it's turned around and come back up to 113. But it's down quite substantially. However, it has not had a very substantial impact on the exports from the Eurozone countries. Why? Because half of their exports are within the Eurozone. So if it's France exporting to Italy or Italy exporting to Germany, that's not going to be affected by the exchange rate. With respect to exporting outside, a common characteristic of European firms is that they invoice in dollars. So they pick a dollar price for their products because they have to compete in a global economy, and they don't change that very quickly. So changes in the ratio of the euro to the dollar don't affect their export prices except with a very long lag. And so what we're seeing is that despite the sharp fall in the value of the euro, there has not been any substantial increase. So that means that the ECB is now focusing on using low interest rates as a way of getting increased borrowing by businesses in Europe. In the bond market, where the ECB is now buying corporate bonds, and from banks, where the ECB is lending to the banks at negative interest rates. It's not having a very big effect. It's having a relatively small effect. And ironically, much of the purchasing of European bonds is being done by American firms who are taking advantage of these low interest rates. So I think, unfortunately, the situation is a very serious one in which Europe is stuck with a high unemployment rate, a low growth rate, a low inflation rate, and doesn't really have a policy, a strategy for moving it forward. Let me turn to the situation in Japan, which also has serious problems, and I think also lacks a good strategy for dealing with them. GDP has declined recently. The CPI is basically flat. The budget deficit is more than 6% of GDP, and the debt to GDP ratio is over 200%. In addition to that, the Japanese population is shrinking and the labor force is shrinking, and that makes dealing with their long-term debt problems all the more difficult. But at the same time, Japan is a very prosperous country. The level of per capita income in Japan, these are always hard to make these comparisons, but the official numbers suggest that the per capita real income in Japan is comparable to that of Britain or France. So the public is pretty content, and the unemployment rate is less than 3.5%. So there isn't a lot of incentive to change things. When Mr. Abe came to office, he announced that he wanted to make changes that would get the inflation rate positive, get the growth rate higher. He appointed Mr. Kuroda as head of the Bank of Japan. He said he would have a strategy with 3 parts. One would be an easier monetary policy under the Bank of Japan. Second would be fiscal incentives, and the third would be structural reforms. Well, Mr. Kuroda obliged by bringing down interest rates very sharply. That had the effect of causing the yen to fall. That raised the profits of Japanese exporters, but it didn't induce them to increase their exports to the rest of the world. So it didn't have a positive impact on Japan's growth rate. And at the same time, it increased the costs to Japanese households of imported products, and that depressed economic activity. Mr. Kuroda has continued to promise that there will be higher inflation in the future. The public, sort of a bare majority of the public now thinks that there will be more than 2% inflation, but they have thought that for the last several years, and yet it's not happening. I think the decision to go to a negative interest rate in Japan is hurting Japanese financial institutions, confusing the public, and not doing anything for aggregate demand. The second of the 3 arrows in the Abe strategy was the fiscal policy. He began with a fiscal stimulus that was then immediately offset by an increase in the value-added tax from 5% to 8%, which pushed the Japanese economy into recession for 2 quarters in a row. So at this point, although I gather he has just decided to do some more fiscal stimulus in the coming year, there's nothing significant coming from that source. And finally, there were the promises of structural reform. But here again, as far as I can see, and talking to my Japanese friends, and when I go to Tokyo, as far as I can see, there's been very little achieved. There's been a small increase in the female labor force participation rate. There's been a big increase in the number of tourists coming to Japan to take advantage of the cheaper yen. There have been changes in agricultural policies, but they are phased in over a very long period of time. What Japan needs is an increase in immigration to boost its population, but there is a very strong aversion to increasing immigration. People are content with a high standard of living, with a homogeneous population, and they don't want to change things. So I think looking forward, the big problem that Japan has is its enormous fiscal deficit. That's the one thing that can't continue forever. With a deficit of more than 6% of GDP, there was a plan to raise the value-added tax from 8% to 10% in April of 2017, but what I've just seen in the news from Tokyo, they've decided to postpone that. So maybe it'll happen in 18 and maybe it'll happen in 19. But in the meantime, the deficit will stay very large and the debt to GDP ratio will continue to grow very rapidly. So in summary, it's an economy that is very prosperous, but that has a potential time bomb of growing deficits and debt for which they do not have a strategy. You've been very generous in giving me a lot of time to talk, and if I believe the schedule, I still have a few minutes. Is that right?
Sure,
okay.
yes.
Well, there are still a few countries left to talk about. So let me say a little bit about China and a little bit about India. I've been in both of those in the last months. When I was in China about a month ago and talked to key economic officials, I came away with a sense that they really have shifted their strategy. There really is a consensus that one of the things that they want to do is to move to what they call supply-side reforms. And they say to me, well, Mr. Feldstein, you were with President Reagan. Those were great supply-side reforms. Tell us about it. Well, it has nothing to do with supply-side reforms in China. In the United States, it meant bringing down tax rates, providing incentives for individuals and for businesses, and that was very successful. But in China, supply-side reforms means reducing the excess capacity in state-owned enterprises, particularly in heavy industry. And the government has made a decision to start down that path. They recognize and have said publicly that millions of people will be laid off in the process. They've put money in the budget to deal with it. So I think they're testing the market. They're testing the politics and they're testing the economics to see whether they can do that on a much larger scale. Because even though laying off 4 or 5 million people, which are the numbers they talk about, sound large, that's small relative to the amount of excess capacity that exists in China. And there's clearly a tension between those who want to emphasize that and those who favor easing monetary and fiscal policies to stimulate the economy. I think we will see both of those happening, but I think that there will be a definite emphasis on bringing down excess capacity. The Chinese officials are also worried about the growth of bank debt and non-performing loans. Fortunately, in my judgment, that situation is very different from what happened in the Asian financial crisis, with a lot of external debt, and what has happened in the United States, where the debt was mostly internal, but was private debt. So in China, these are the debts of state-owned enterprises and of local governments to state-owned banks. So in the end, if it doesn't work out naturally, I think the central government will step in and absorb some of that excess debt, some of those losses. And fortunately, the level of the government debt in China relative to GDP is very low, well below 50%. So they have the fiscal capacity to do so. Finally, a word about the exchange rate policy in China. I think at best you'd have to say that what's happening is very confusing. The renminbi, the yuan, has been declining relative to the dollar, and that has created problems for China in Washington. But at the same time, on a trade-weighted basis, the renminbi has been rising. The currency has been strengthening. And so the Chinese have said that they're going to manage the currency relative to a basket of currencies. And that would mean giving them scope to reduce the value of the renminbi relative to a whole basket of currencies to become more competitive than they are today. But they don't want to say that publicly. So they talk just about the exchange rate between the renminbi and the dollar, because there's a fear that if they start talking about targeting the basket of currencies, that will be interpreted by the public as a plan to reduce the value of the renminbi, and that will lead to increased capital flight. So they're caught trying to do one thing while talking about it in a different way. But if I had to bet on what's going to happen over the next year or two, I think there will be a small but gradual decline in the value of the renminbi. Finally, let me say a few words about India. India is doing very well. India is growing at about 7.5%. And I pressed my Indian friends and my people I know inside the government in India, are those numbers real? Should we believe those? And they say yes. So if they say it, I have to believe it. So 7.5% real growth in India. So at the macro level, I would say India is managing itself quite well. The inflation rate has come down to about 5%. The current account deficit is only about 1%. But what really matters for the long run in India is the structural policies. And there, unfortunately, they have not been doing very well. Mr. Modi, the head of the Indian government, has emphasized three kinds of policies. The first is a national goods and services tax, a kind of national value-added tax to replace the individual state-by-state taxes. That would be an important thing that would help their economy. So far, they haven't been able to get it through the parliament because of the capability of the Congress party to block in the upper house. But they're just having an election now. We'll get the results later this week. And the optimists say that the Congress party will lose its blocking capability. And even though the BJP, Mr. Modi's party, will not have a majority in the upper house, they will have the ability to get legislation through. So that would be a big positive and worth watching. The other two reforms, less optimistic. Modi has talked about correctly the need for labor market reforms. If they're going to have a serious manufacturing economy, they're going to have reforms in the labor markets. He has not been able to get the parliament to accept those reforms, even in his own party, and so he has said we're going to leave that to the individual states. The states will, if they want to attract business, will have to have more favorable labor market reforms, and that will then, through a competitive process among the states, lead to a gradual improvement in labor market policies. Well, I hope that works, but so far it hasn't worked. So far there's been, well, one state that has done something, but only for very small businesses. And finally, there's land acquisition policy. It's an enormous barrier to any businesses that want to expand or that want to move. And again, it is held up at the level of the individual states. It's a very federal system in India. And again, Mr. Modi has said, I have to leave that to the individual states. When he was the chief minister of the state of Gujarat, he made important changes that attracted businesses to Gujarat, and he said, why don't the other chief ministers follow what we did? Well, that would be a good idea, but it hasn't happened yet. And on top of those things, I worry very much about primary education in India, which is really something of a disaster. So there's India doing very, very well, higher real growth rate than any other large economy in the world, and yet, despite the increases in real incomes, the possibilities for doing much better are there if they can deal with these structural problems. Well, I think I've talked long enough, and so I would now look forward to questions from all of you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Sit down, okay?
Well, we can keep you all day, you know. Thank you very much for very, very illuminating and penetrating overview of global economic terrain and major economies of the world today. Since our time is limited, at this point, why don't I invite some comments and the questions from the floor, and then we'll have some interactions with Professor Feldstein. Now, are there any? Yes, one hand's there in the back, and then Dr. Kim and the Ambassador. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Daniel. I'm a newspaper of the Economy Chosun. My question is about if Donald Trump is elected president. Sorry. So many worries about that he would ask the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I'm wondering what if the United States would do better without Trans-Pacific partnerships? Overall, what is your expectation from the Trump presidency?
Okay. And then, yes,
thank you very much, Professor. Ordinarily, very early in the morning, I would not listen to more than 30 minutes. But I was very much awake the entire time. I've enjoyed this very much. My question relates to what I've been told, that in the United States, if the economy is good, the Democrats win. If the economy is bad, the Republicans win. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but I've heard you, and I was counting 5 times, you're saying the economy is good. What's your prediction now for the elections?
Okay, the last one, Dr. Kim, yes.
Thank you, Professor Feldstein. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, but your talk was very thorough and comprehensive. Unfortunately, the story is bleak. For all the developed economies, we are at the edge of difficult points, and worse yet, the toolboxes are empty. By that I mean the national debts to GDP ratio is at the edge. You have no more tools to play with interest rates. you pointed out a very simple solution for the United States. Simple by concept, but very, very difficult to execute practicality, because in practice, to reduce the deficit would require a political process, which is held hostage, or at least it believes it is held hostage by the populism. Therefore, the long-term solution calls for either of the two things. The population become as intelligent as at least at the level of your undergraduates, or the political system itself will modify itself so that it will not be held hostage to the populism. How do you see the solutions? Thank you.
Okay.
So let me start with the first question, which narrowest question, and that is about TPP and how the election affects that. Well, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have spoken against TPP. And I think that's because in the case of Clinton, Sanders, her opponent, sort of pushed her into that position because he was speaking against it, and so she wanted to take that issue off the table. So she said that in its current form, she does not support TPP. My guess is that she becomes president of the United States, and that if she does, there will be some small modifications in TPP necessary to get it through the Congress with her blessing. So I think that's what will happen. We will see some technical, very small technical changes that probably have little or no effect on Korea, and that she will support it, and then there's a pretty good chance that it will actually get enacted. Trump is a total wild card. We don't know what he would do about this. We don't know what he would do about anything else. And so the question is, does he really stand a chance to get elected? Well, we knew months ago that he didn't stand a chance to become the nominee, and now it looks like he is going to be the nominee. And what concerns me is not that he is very popular, because he has support from maybe 30% of the voters, but that she, Mrs. Clinton, is very unpopular in her own party. And so many of the people who supported Sanders, her lefter wing opponent, may decide to support Trump in the general election. That would be a terrible thing, but it shows that Trump has been very clever in not defining himself as left or right. He is a man determined to make America great again. Well, it's hard to be against doing that, and so I think he will sweep up some of the disaffected votes that don't like her. So I think that's where the danger is. And then if he becomes president, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, TPP is one of the less important risks that we face. Let me turn to the ambassador's. Let me turn to the ambassador's question about Republicans versus Democrats, good economy and bad economy. I think that's too simple a picture of how the economy interacts. I think it depends on who's in office as well. But I think this is not an economy-driven election. And what I know and what you all know now about the strength of the U.S. economy is not shared by the American public, is not shared by the journalists. So we continue to hear how incomes have not risen for decades. It's just false. It's false because we measure it badly, and yet it appeals to people to say, it's very hard to know whether your income has improved or not, but the idea that the average American's income hasn't, that things haven't gotten substantially better in the last decade or 2 decades, with all of the innovations, all of the new products, all of the quality change, that's, in my judgment, nonsense. But I think people are being told by both sides, by both political parties, that things have not gotten better, and I think that has contributed to the uncertainty of this outcome. Now, you were talking about the emerging market countries. No, you were. I thought you said the developed countries. Yes. So I'm sorry. Yes. Well, I have to share your pessimism, because that's what I said about Europe and about Japan, that Britain is in a different case. Canada is in a fine case. The Canadians, I don't think the Canadians are all smarter than Americans, but somehow or other they managed to have a very small fiscal deficit, a low rate of inflation, a low unemployment rate. They're doing very well, despite the fact that they're an energy-based economy. So what's the prospect in the U.S. of shrinking the deficit in the years ahead? Short answer, I don't know. Paul Ryan, who is the head of the House Republicans, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, has always emphasized the importance of doing that, slowing the growth of entitlements, going after some of the so-called tax expenditures, the tax spending that's built into the tax code. And so could he find some agreements with Hillary Clinton in which some little things that she wants, more daycare, more benefits for single mothers, in exchange for some of these more fundamental long-term changes? Maybe. I wouldn't want to bet a lot on it, but I think that's my greatest hope.
Okay, just another round of questions or comments. Okay, Ambassador Her and yes, and okay, yes, lady there. Okay, sorry.
Thank you again very much for your comprehensive check of the global economy. I also have three questions, mostly related to this Trump. Some people say if Trump becomes the president of the U.S., it will be probably he'll be the last president of the U.S. Such is the disaster. The first question is that, as you said, Trump is a wild card. But some people say he's very shrewd, so that whatever he says is just a tactics to win the vote. And he may not be as crazy as he may sound. As you mentioned, he intention not define himself. So once he comes into office, actual policy might not be as crazy. That's number one. The second comment is that actually the U.S. has a very well established check and balance system. Congress, mass media, academia, so that even if he tries to do something very wild, actually the system is going to work to check the damage. That's another point of view. The third thing I would like to ask is that whether he becomes a president or not, the real problem here seems to be there's anger and frustration against the elite group or establishment. They cannot do anything about this disappearing middle class, all this divergence of the income. And some of them might be, as you mentioned, it's just a measurement problem which is fanned up by these two political parties. But actually people feel that way, and it's not just the US, it's across the world. So whether he becomes a president or not, what are you going to do about this underlying problem, the frustration and anger against the establishment? That's my question.
Those are three very good questions. Let me see if I can deal with them. Let me start with the last one, and that is the middle class that seems to be falling in standard of living and so on. Again, it's a statistical artifact. It's not true. And the real question is, why does the press, which, as you say, should rise above this, should be part of the checks and balances on irrational behavior, why does it not see the fact? So the Congressional Budget Office, which is a very large statistical agency, nonpartisan, reports to the Congress, did a careful study on what's happened to middle-income households. Quite apart from what I said about the general mismanagement of real income. So just taking the official figures as they are, they said that if you look over the last roughly 20 years, middle-income households, in terms of the cash money that they have received, have seen a very small increase. But if you take into account the fringe benefits that they get from companies and the transfer payments that they get from the government, food stamps, housing subsidies, Social Security, and so on, their incomes have increased quite substantially. So this is not a secret. This is not a classified document. I've read it and written about it in the popular press to try to get an interest, but it's much easier to say the middle class is being beaten down, has no income, and so on. So it's a serious problem. I suspect it's a problem in other countries as well, but I don't know the data as much. But that's, I think somehow there has to be an improved understanding on the part of the politicians and on the part of the public if we're going to fix this. Now, your second thing was about checks and balances, and I think that's a very important point, and it allows me to sleep at night, because with respect to domestic policies, anything that requires legislation has to get through the House of Representatives. So it doesn't matter if it's Hillary Clinton trying to do very left-wing things or President Trump trying to do crazy things. If it has to get through the House of Representatives, it's going to have to pass a Republican barrier. So I think bad things on the domestic side are not going to happen. And as I said in answer to an earlier question, I think there's a reasonable chance that if Hillary Clinton is president, she won't want to just sit there and accomplish nothing, hoping that she'll be able to regain the House of Representatives in 2018. Instead, I think she will want to negotiate with the Republicans, and if they can find, and Ryan likes to negotiate. The head of the Republicans in the House has worked with Democrats before, not with Obama, but with the Democrats in the Senate. I think that's more a statement about Obama's difficulty in negotiating. She's much more of a negotiator. We know that from her previous experience when she was a senator. So I think that's where, but the danger is on the foreign policy side, where the president has much more discretion, the use of the military and everything else. As long as he does it within the existing budgets, he doesn't need to get the same kind of congressional authorization. So that's what worries me about that.
Okay, now yes, and then Mr. Rooney later. Yes, there, and yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Feldstein. I'm Haekyung Kim from Ewha Women's University. My question is about the Korean economy. The current government has been pushing structural reform. In my observation, it doesn't seem to be very, successful so far. And interest rate is almost fixed, and the price of asset is stable, and the government is considering fiscal policy recently. So I want to, ask to share your observation and prospects about the Korean economy. Thank you.
Why don't you invite him?
예, 말씀 잘 들었습니다. 저는 이제 직접적인 질문을 하고자 합니다. 예, 미국의 오바마 대통령께서는 한국에 대해서 아주 긍정적인 언급을 자주 하셨습니다. 그런데 이제 미국 대통령 선거를 보면 트럼프 후보께서도 한국에 대해서 자주 언급을 하셨거든요. 그래서 트럼프 후보가 만약에 대통령이 되었을 때 한국은 뭐 경제라든지 정치적으로 어떠한 변화가 올 것으로 보시는지요? 예, 감사합니다.
I'm not sure which of those two questions is harder for me. I repeat about Trump that it is impossible to know what he would do. It's impossible to know what he would do about Europe, what he would do about Mexico, what he would do about Korea. So I can't offer you any insight at all. And I wish I knew more about the Korean economy. When I look at the aggregate performance numbers for the Korean economy, they look, in comparison to other OECD countries, pretty good in terms of fiscal deficits, in terms of inflation, in terms of unemployment. But it's always possible to do better. And historically, Korea has been such a superstar in terms of real growth rates that no doubt better policies could lead to improvements. But I don't follow the Korean economy closely enough to really offer a detailed comment.
Okay, the last one, and Mr. Yes.
So, Professor Feldstein, it's delightful to see you again in Korea. And you were very careful to avoid addressing the Korean economy, but my two prior questioners have challenged you on that. Let me fill in a couple of blanks for you, because I believe that Korea is currently in an extraordinary situation that's arguably completely different from all of its history would suggest. On the one hand, the Korean economy, perhaps for the first time in the last 40 or 50 years, is growing at a slower rate than the global economy. That, to me, for Korea, not just its national pride, but its economic prowess, is a crisis. At the same time, ironically, Korea has suddenly become the country with too much money. Korea is facing the prospect of having domestic pension funds in particular accumulate vast amounts of assets, over $3 trillion equivalent, over the next 25 years. Of course, it'll be one of these curves, but the point is that during this next several decades, Korea will have so much domestic savings accumulated through the pension system, just as a matter of course, that if that money were to stay at home, it would destroy the asset values of everything in the country. In other words, Korea's money needs to go and work in other people's countries, which is a complete paradigm shift for Korea over the last 50 years, when it was the poor country that needed everybody else's capital. You're here for Citadel. Hopefully you will be part of that solution together with your colleagues from Citadel. But Korea needs to face that paradigm shift. Korea needs to understand that that's a huge shift, and it needs to unlock the capital markets and the currency so that money can flow out of Korea, go to other places, be productively used, and come back with a profit, generate income for those pensioners, of whom I will be one. And I think, whilst you may not have answers, and I may not have asked a question yet, those are two thoughts I'd like you to take away with you. The country that used to grow at 8% per annum for 40 years, right, is now slipping below the global rate of growth. And Korea is a country with essentially only one natural resource. Everything else we have to import. That natural resource is its human capital. The people in this room and all their brothers and sisters throughout the country who are very, very talented, but haven't actually been prepared for the world of the future and need to be reworked, revitalized, educationally and skills and so forth. Whilst at the same time, those same people are generating this excess of financial capital that, if we're not careful, will destroy values here. Could you perhaps comment on the latter one of those, the danger of Korea not addressing the need to deploy its domestic capital overseas? The National Pension Fund, for example, again to give you some data, is starting to become the largest shareholder in many of the companies listed on the KOSPI.
Let me start with the first of your observations about Korea now having a growth rate which is less than the global average. Of course, the global average reflects a large country with low incomes. So it reflects what's happening in India with a 7.5% growth rate, or China with a roughly 6% growth rate. So Korea has, having had a great performance for decades, now has a much higher level of income. So I wouldn't expect it to be able to grow in the same catch-up way that these other very large, very poor countries are doing. So I don't think that should be a worrying thing, even though emotionally, psychologically, it may be to a country that was accustomed to being right up there at the very top of the league tables. I think what you say about diversifying the national savings is a very important point. Other countries have done that very explicitly. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, they have pension funds which are explicitly internationalized, rules that say they must invest abroad. And I think just as for any individual, it would be more prudent to diversify a portfolio away. There tends to be the keep money close to home bias, but I think diversification would be to Korea's advantage. So let's hope that happens.
Okay, we can keep Professor Feldstein all day here, but he has a busy schedule, and he was generous enough to share his insights with us this morning, and he covered the wide range of issues and countries. So we'll end this morning lecture here, and next time again, I'm sure, whenever he comes near to this region, I'll always bring him back to Seoul, and maybe within this year or next year for sure, he'll be back with us to share his insights again. Well, please join me in thanking him for sharing his views.